Nissan. One of Japan's more important automakers, in the States, the brand is known for selling road terrors for those with poor credit and hawking more or less the same sports cars for over a decade. Many people who were children at the time of the R35 GTR's debut now have children of their own. Some of these kids might even be cognizant of what cars are. Despite having a less than exciting model lineup these days, Nissan does have a significant motorsport heritage, winning many championships and series worldwide. This was largely in the past, as Nissan's motorsports focus today is domestic series and giant bumper car, Formula E. Let's focus on different times for Nissan and talk about the R391, Nissan's last traditional sports prototype. Before the R391, Nissan had challenged the top GT class with a handful of cars, scoring 6 top 10s, but never being able to fight at the front for the race's duration. Their 1997 through 1998 R390 effort was one of the stronger ones, but it may have been compromised by being leftovers from unrelated Group C cars instead of its own clean sheet design. With the end of Nissan's contract with TWR, came the freedom to consider new design choices for their Le Mans Challenger. Although 4 top 10 finishes in 1998 was and is an admirable result for any manufacturer, the top 2 positions were occupied by Porsche. Not ideal. These top 10 finishes were also acquired by reliability and not overall pace. With the fear of getting leapfrogged in development again in their hearts, Nissan decided not to renew their contract with TWR and came up with the completely fresh approach for 1999. Nissan instead entered a partnership with the English branch of IndyCar constructor G-Force. This arrangement allowed for more freedom for Nissan to do the things that they want to do, as well as not dealing with the apparent grudge that the ACO had with TWR. And by completely fresh, I mean Nissan went back to the drawing board completely with the new car. There would be no old Group C engines or chassis used in this new vehicle, the R391. Echoing its 1960 spiritual predecessor, the R381, the R391 would be an open-top prototype immediately following a closed-top race car. Nissan read the regulations and felt that a ground-up, unambiguous prototype would be a better choice than developing the R390 more. 1999 saw the ACO finally react to the manufacturers running prototypes in the GT1 category and renamed it LMGTP, with no road car requirement. With the ACO admitting that 2 types of prototype would compete for the top step of the podium, the ACO then made efforts to equalize the classes. First of all, GTP cars lost the fuel capacity advantage they enjoyed over the LMPs, as both were allotted a maximum of 90 liters, which is around 25 gallons. That's a good size for a beginner aquarium. LMPs also lost their small weight advantage, with LMPs being required to weigh at least 900 kilograms, or 1,984 pounds. This was equivalent to the minimum weight that turbocharged GT1 cars can run in 1998, though none of them reached it. Driving aids like traction control or ABS were outlawed, forcing the drivers to rely purely on their hands and feet for car control. The R390 used these systems, putting the onus on Nissan to design an easy-to-drive and responsive machine without the crutch of electronic aids. One strange quirk of the LMP regulations was a mandatory 330mm or around 13 inches minimum size for a toolbox in the cockpit, which GTP designers could feel free to ignore. Overall, Le Mans prototypes had 4 major factors in their favor: better outward visibility, wider tires, smaller frontal area, and easier driver changes. Nissan's main design goal was to create a reliable, easy-to-run car that could be potentially sold to privateers in the future. One of the most significant changes from the R390, if you ignore the different chassis and missing roof, was the engine. The R391's power plant was the VRH50A, an engine based off the VH-V8s found in their larger road cars. This ironically gives the R391 a more road-relevant engine than its predecessor, which in theory was supposed to be a road car. However, this video is not the time to open the can of worms on what the R390 was classified as. That car had a Group C engine. This engine was semi-stress mounted, which means it was bolted to the back of the chassis with some additional bracing. This may be because VRH50A was not initially a race engine, and therefore not designed to take all of the car's structural loads. Like most engine codes, VRH50A has a meaning if you're familiar with Nissan engines. V means V layout, R means racing, H for 8 cylinders, 50 for 5-liter capacity, and A for natural aspiration. Natural aspiration? In a Japanese race car from this era? Japanese manufacturers in the 1990s almost always turbocharged their top-flight race cars, so Nissan of all companies turning their back on the guaranteed method of increasing power was a bit head-scratching. Nissan had good reasons for it, however. First of all, this was still the 1990s, so modern turbochargers that spool quickly and provide high boosts were still getting the kinks worked out. This meant turbo lag. Although Le Mans had few slow corners where turbo lag could be an issue, much of the R391's design brief was to provide a car comfortable enough to its drivers over long distances. Drivers want maximum responsiveness out of the car's engine, so out the twin turbos went. Packaging was another major reason that Nissan went naturally aspirated. When an engine is turbocharged, someone's going to have to figure out where the turbos, intercooler, and their plumbing fit, as well as increase the airflow to those areas so they don't overheat. Turbos and their ancillaries add also another potential failure point to the complex system that is a racing car. Nissan also felt that its turbo cars would be annoying to run outside of the factory. To Nissan's credit, the previous VRH35 was a solid engine suffering few failures in its competitive career, even when privateers used it. Despite this, the Japanese manufacturer wanted to minimize any potential cheats to the armor, so out the turbos went. Onto the engine itself, the VRH50A was a 5-liter V8 with an over-square 96mm bore and 86.3mm stroke design, with dual overhead cams and a flat plane crankshaft. Wait, this sounds familiar to people that followed FIA GT in 1998. The almost all-conquering Mercedes CLK LM used a similar engine layout to win 8 out of 9 races that it entered. Ironically, the 9th race was Le Mans, where they suffered early failures. Could this be foreshadowing? Coincidence aside, the VRH50A was on the test bench long before the CLK LM turned the wheel. As for figures, the Nissan motor produced over 620 horsepower at 7,000 RPM and 479 pound-feet of torque at 6,000. These figures are less than what Nissan claimed for the VRH35L, which was 641 horsepower at 6,800 RPM and 521 pound-feet of torque at 4,400, but the dynamic qualities of the engine were supposed to make up for the loss in power and torque. After all, what good is the higher torque if you're mired in turbo lag? It was also 20 kilograms lighter than the VRH35L, despite the larger displacement, 150 kilograms versus 170 kilograms. Anyway, a medium-sized, to American standards, naturally aspirated V8, is a solid option for powering race cars from the past, present, and possibly future. The cash-strapped Nissan's decision to switch makes sense. The rest of the car was designed to be as simple and sturdy as the engine. One of the main goals was to increase downforce compared to the R390. As a GT1 car primarily optimized for Le Mans, it didn't produce that much. Nismo Tsutomu Nagashima was chief designer, bringing the R391's conception more in-house than its predecessor. Veteran race car designer Nigel Stroud worked on the aerodynamics. His resume included cars such as the Mazda Group C cars after Mooncraft and the Porsche 962 GTI. Nagashima and Stroud weren't alone in the design process, as G-Force's Doug Skinner lended a hand on chassis work, amongst other people. The R391's basic design was drawn up sometime in 1998, and the final car didn't change much. Like most Stroud-pinned cars, the R391 was quite conservative overall. Like contemporary open-wheelers, the footboxes raised slightly for better driver safety and to allow for more space for air to flow under the front diffuser. It's unknown how this diffuser looks on the underside, but its presence is implied by the exits directly behind the front wheels that exhaust air coming under the front end, as well as some pressure from the wheel wells. These vents started becoming more common on prototype Sensu Lotto in the late 1990s, as underbody downforce was limited by the mandated flat bottoms. In the R391, the vents had a unique treatment, with the wheel wells being partially blocked off. I guess it was to reduce turbulence from the spinning wheel? Front diffusers were still allowed, as long as they didn't extend past the front wheel centerline. Having a front diffuser shifted the aero balance towards the front, reducing high-speed understeer and working the front tires more. This would be an innovation almost all subsequent Shoot Le Mans prototypes would use. The front splitter was straight across, hinting that the front end stalling from too much load wasn't a huge concern. You can see the R391 porpoising under heavy braking and TV coverage. The front brakes were cooled by a single duct in the crash structure, like many other contemporary prototypes. Another conventional design choice is the pushrod double wishbone suspension setup that's been the standard for top-level race cars for decades. A third spring to control heave was considered, but development time was short, budget was low, and they intended for teams not named Nismo to use the car. Perhaps it would have helped with the porpoising some? The suspension was an evolution of its predecessor design, so nothing too fancy was incorporated. Brembo carbon brakes slowed the car. At this point in time, carbon brakes were starting to proliferate across high-level motorsport, as their price of reduction had dropped a little bit from a decade prior. This was a significant feature distinguishing ACO Rules prototypes from the very similar SR1 and WSC cars, which were forced to run steel brakes. This was also one of the few less conservative features of the R391, and demonstrated that Nismo had their sights set on Le Mans and other ACO run events. Curiously, the R391 likes louvers above the wheel wells that exhaust high-pressure air. Many top-level sports cars had these by 1999, including the R390. They help cool the brakes and increase downforce. Perhaps the R391 likes them because of the internal vent near the front wheel wells. They also add some drag, something you don't want much of at Le Mans. Another departure from the R390 GT1 was the side-mounted radiators, which sacrificed some cooling efficiency for better packaging and lower frontal area, reducing drag. The engine's air boxes were even mounted in the radiator's opening, in the quest to get that coefficient of drag value as low as possible. This layout may not be ideal for airflow to the engine, but fewer things were sticking up in the airstream obstructing the wing's airflow. What did obstruct the airflow was the assumed prerequisite full-width roll hoop. Every prototype before 1998, not counting the WRs because they're rebodied single-seaters, had one of these. So what's the issue? The drag penalty was something that open prototype constructors knew they had to deal with going in, right? Let's just say that someone found a way to make the traditional open cockpit prototype look immediately obsolete. Two constructors, Panoz and BMW, saw a loophole in the rules, which was specifically for WR, mind you, allowing a roll hoop that merely covered the driver's head. This genius decision influenced the design of almost all LMPs going forward, and instantly dated the R391 as a late 90s creation. Like a typical shark, the R391 possessed 5 gill slits, but these ventilated the engine bay instead of providing gas exchange. Although the R391 had lower cooling requirements than its predecessor, a greater proportion of the vital systems were located in the rear. A hot race car is an unhappy race car. The rear brakes were cooled by a pair of NACA ducts atop the engine cover, just like the R390. Another commonality between both cars was the 6-speed sequential gearbox designed by Nissan and supplied by X-Track. This part had proven reliable after thousands of miles of racing in the previous car, which had more torque, remember, so why not reuse it? The casing had to be redesigned to fit the new car better, though. A low-mounted dual-element rear wing sat behind the diffuser that didn't take up the entire space between the rear wheels. This pair of rear downforce generating devices are the most obvious tells that this car was designed as an LMP. GT1-based machinery were mandated to run a single-element wing, and WSCs and SR1s were disallowed for using diffusers. For a car meant for Le Mans, the end plates are surprisingly deep, so a version of the wing with smaller end plates was troweled in the wind tunnel. In a Featherfin first, I revealed aero data for the R391. Overall, the car had a slight rear aero bias, so that front splitter was doing a lot of heavy negative lifting. Perhaps the deep end plates were there to add more downforce to the rear. The last thing you need on a high-speed track is aero-induced oversteer. Hey, that rhymed. Peak downforce had the car producing 2,162 pounds at 150 miles an hour, which is enough to drive the car upside down a tunnel, yada yada yada. The lift-to-drag ratio was 3.1 to 1 at peak downforce, which is pretty good for the era. It far outstripped the McLaren F1 GTR Longtail in its peak downforce setup, which had a lift-to-drag ratio of 2.2 to 1, but the Toyota TS020 was noticeably more aero-efficient with a drag ratio of 3.32 to 1. This configuration was presumably used just in testing for reasons I'll get to later. The car likely ran a low drag setup which had a worse lift to drag, which was somewhere in the range of 2.36 to 1, but every mile per hour down the Mulsanne straight counts. All this combined led to a car that weighed at 847 kilograms dry, so the car could add ballast in strategic locations. This was a privileged downforce to the R390 from what I can tell. Overall, the R391 was a product of the transitional era it debuted in. Built with state-of-the-art materials, but using conservative design choices. The car was completed sometime in February 1999 and began testing at Paul Ricard, another French circuit with long straightaways. In these days of years-long dev time for sports cars, this seems rushed, but most race cars of this era were thrown together pretty quickly. This includes the R390. Nissan's main goal with this program was to compete at a pointing in the field instead of relying on attrition like the year prior, and a fast car would be also attractive to the potential customers they intend to buy it in the medium term. Nissan would attempt Le Mans with a 3-car strategy. 2 of the cars would be R391s, while the third would be a Courage C52, an upgraded version of the C51 with the R390's BRH35L engine. That card's a story for another time. R391 number 22 would be driven by Eric Komas, Satoshi Motoyama, and Michael Krum, while Aguri Suzuki, Eric Van de Poel, and Masami Kagayama would pilot the number 23. This driver lineup had a strong mix of Le Mans, JGTC, and Formula 1 experience, which would hopefully guide Nissan to the top step on the podium. Unfortunately, an April test was delayed by a monocoque damaging crash 5 laps in, so the R391 had limited opportunity to prove its reliability. There was nowhere in Japan or Europe to race an ACO rules prototype at the time. Nor would entering the ALMS be very cost effective for a team as broke as Nissan. 2 more chances to test the R391 popped up in May, with the Le Mans pre-qualifying test and a final test station at Paul Ricard. Before it became a dress rehearsal a week before the event, the big 24-hour race in France would whittle down its field in a big pre-qualifying session. 31 prototypes fought for 28 grid positions. This also allowed the team to trial last-minute changes in relevant testing conditions. The fastest of the Nissans will lap Le Mans in 3 minutes and 36 seconds. This would be an incredible pace for 1998 and 4 seconds faster than the R390 ever was, but it was still 5 seconds adrift of the updated Toyota TS020. At least Nissan had the excuse of a totally new car with little testing on a low budget. Either way, the time was fast enough for midfield amongst the prototypes, so Nissan was comfortably in the race. In the race, however, is not the same as winning. So Nissan scheduled a Paul Ricard test to iron out issues noted in pre-qualifying. For one, the final drive liked to shake itself apart while the car was at top speed. A driver spent 70% of the lap at Le Mans flat out, so it was imperative that this gets fixed. The brakes also had minor issues, which were also apparently solved at the end of testing. During the test proper, the drivers found the car easy to drive and competitive, despite the late gestation and limited testing. Had Nissan cracked the code to Le Mans victory? The biggest race of the century rolled around a month later, and Nissan had even stiffer competition than the gauntlet they ran last year. The already scary TS020 was set to blow past the 3-minute 30 barrier in qualifying, pace not seen since the days of Group C. Mercedes brought the low-drag CLR, a car that had completed thousands of miles of testing on high-speed tracks similar to Le Mans. BMW, like Nissan, knew an open-top prototype was the way of the future and brought a pair of V12 LMRs. Porsche took a apparent hiatus, but its corporate stablemate, newcomer Audi, would bring 4 cars to the fray, a pair each of R8R LMPs and R8C GTPs. Audi tended to dominate whatever series it entered, so they were a team to watch out for in the future. Paynos would also bring a similar machine to the R391. An LMP powered by a sizable naturally aspirated V8. Unlike the R391, this V8 was front-mounted, and Paynos had 2 years worth of experience with their GTR1, which was a very similar car. Against the works competition, Nissan had its work cut out for it with its entirely new car. Even if the other works cars were to all run into problems, a raft of privateer entries were there to keep Nissan from relaxing. If this video wasn't about one specific car, I'd go into some detail about them. Although qualifying is fairly unimportant during a 24-hour long race, I might as well mention how well Nissan did. After all, this is the beginning of the 24-hour sprint era. Toyota took pole with a 329.93. The Japanese giant wanted more than anyone to finally win the big French race and not lose the circumstance. How well did Nissan do? Well, the number 22 R391 qualified 12th with a 336.04. The Courage was 3 seconds and 4 places behind with a 339.23. What about the number 23? Unfortunately, it suffered a stuck throttle at Tete Rouge during qualifying 2 and crashed out, blowing a hole in the tub. Eric Van de Poel was put on 4 weeks bed rest, and Nismo was already down a car. Nissan looked like the Red Queen of qualifying with this performance, staying at more or less the same relative pace despite going faster than previous year. Like 1998, Nissan would have to rely on the R391's strong pace on long runs and wait for the competition to falter. If that fails, well, there's still that Courage waiting in the wings. Race day arrived, and Nissan found itself patiently waiting behind an Audi as all the faster works entries hogged the attention. He barely even saw the car on the American TV broadcast as the camera direction focused on the Mercedes, Beamers, and Toyotas fighting at the front, and the stricken cars in the pits. Steady pace, fast pit work, and reliability saw the car climb up the order as its competitors made mistakes varying from small slip-ups to sport-defining mishaps. At one point, the R391 muscled its way up to 4th place, until a tire blew. After that setback, the front clip came loose and the car had to suffer yet another unplanned service. The R391's cleanish run would end after 8 hours when the power cut out near the Porsche curves. Motoyama would try to fix it for 30 minutes, but threw in the towel. The car retired with electrical issues or a head gasket failure depending on the source. A shameful end for such a valiant effort with good potential. According to Nismo, they had planned to triple stint the drivers and go on attacking runs as the night progressed. Nismo still had one more bullet in the gun, and the Courage C52 soldiered on to a respectable 8th place, though losing to the factory Courage which still had a Nissan engine. As for Toyota, the string of mishaps continued, with the remaining car coming home second to BMW after a late puncture. The other two crashed in the night. It won its class at least. Nissan could also take a minor victory with an open LMP being the superior choice after all. With Le Mans done and dusted, Nismo licked its wounds and prepared for the R391's next outing, the Fuji 1000 km. An event with a long history, the Fuji 1000 km was discontinued when prototype racing imploded in the early 1990s. Don Panos, founder of the American Le Mans series, wanted to revive it as a prologue to the potential Asian Pacific Le Mans series. There were a couple of problems with that. First of all, the JGTC took up most of the sports car interest in Japan. Outside of Nissan's home country, the top-level sports car infrastructure is close to non-existent. Second of all, where are all the prototypes coming from? Nissan considered selling R391s, but the company was circling the drain financially. Toyota's efforts were all going to Formula 1, so good luck buying a TS020. Importing prototypes from Europe or the USA would be prohibitively expensive. Japanese pure racing instructors are rare, and the biggest one, Doma, had nothing ready at the moment, which is another story for another time. Lastly, the days of cutting the roofs off Group C cars were nearly over, and most of those cars were in museums, storage, or left in the elements. This lack of prototype infrastructure led to the 1999 Fuji 1000 km being a one-off event. Whoever won this event would get a free Le Mans invite for 2000, however. Nissan would face off against 4 other prototypes amidst the grid that looked like it was plucked straight from Gran Turismo. Toyota would bring a singular TS020 to the event in an attempt to finally win a race overall. It goes without saying that they were the pre-race favorites. Doma and Go would bring a revised BMW V12 Le Mans similar to the car that DNF'd hours after Nissan did at Le Mans. Much less of a threat. Even less scary was the Rally and Scott Ford run by Auto EXE, a car designed for high downforce American tracks, and Hito Tsuyama's McLaren F1 GTR Longtail, a car that became obsolete when true prototypes gained a foothold in the GT1 class. Nissan were pretty much guaranteed at least second place if they executed the race well. Despite Toyota winding down their sports car involvement, they still upgraded their car mildly for Fuji, and Nissan would follow suit. The engine's airbox melted and the radiator vents brought power, but Nismo had little time to fix it before Le Mans. The airbox was moved to a more conventional location atop the engine cover. Small dive flames sprouted along the front fenders to increase downforce. Fuji may be a high-speed circuit, but you spend more time quartering there than you do at Le Mans. The gearshift actuation was changed from a stick to paddles, allowing the driver to change gears more quickly and comfortably. With these small upgrades, the R391 will be ready for its next challenge. Prototype qualifying would be a 2-horse race between Nissan and Toyota. Toyota struck first blood with the 1:16.352. Nissan would attempt to better that time, but a small lockup killed Eric Komasa's fast lap, leaving Team Nismo to settle for second with a 1:16.814. The other prototypes were several seconds behind. Come race day, Toyota would quickly pull ahead with the TS020. Nissan barely having an answer for the clearly more advanced Scarlet Beast pace-wise. Conditions were moist, and the car struggled to warm up its tires. Nissan would double stint the R391's tires to save roughly 30 seconds in the pits. Toyota wouldn't, and changed tires every time the TS020 pitted. The TS020 put a lap on the entire field by the 42 of Fuji. Execution was another story, and that's where things began to unravel for the TS020. First of all, the team got penalized for speeding in the pits with a 1-minute stop and hold, enough time for the Nissan to catch up. Nismo had paid attention to pit speed limits like responsible racers. Furthermore, the Toyota team suffered from a flat battery mid-race, leaving the team scrambling to replace it. Lastly, they got another drive-through penalty for passing other yellows, because the driver couldn't see the flag well. These sloppy mistakes allowed Nismo to take the lead and score a 1-lap victory for the R391 for its second race against the one car that everyone worried about. This gave the R391 an automatic entry into the 2000 Le Mans to make up for its DNF the year prior. Unfortunately, this would not come to pass as Nissan's financial struggles came to a head. Renault took partial ownership of the company in March 1999. With new ownership came a new CEO, Carlos Ghosn, who cost-cut Nissan into profitability. Amongst the first things to go were all forms of motorsport not named JGTC. So the R391 was actually running on borrowed time throughout most of its development cycle. The promising program was snuffed out the Tuesday following the race. Nissan's engine supply to Courage would be cancelled simultaneously. The end of the Fuji 1000 kilometers marked the end of the cat and mouse game that Nissan and Toyota played in international and domestic sports car racing that went on for decades. Both R391s were rest in Nissan's storage facility in Zama, with only number 23 wheeled out for the occasional demonstration run. One of these runs, in 2000, was more serious and trialed a revised paddle shift system, perhaps a JGTC, or a future sports car. The last time this car is known to have run in real life is the 2014 Nismo Festival. The car also spent a brief stint in Fuji Speedway's museum before returning to Nissan. Perhaps the R391 reminded Nissan of a tough time in its history, so they licensed it out to exactly 2 games: Le Mans 24 Hours and Forza Motorsport 2023. Personally, I think that this is part of the reason that the car is somewhat forgotten, as most of the other significant race cars of the late 1990s are common sights in video games. This has definitely made the era beloved for fans around their late 20s, early 30s. In fact, the R391's direct predecessor, as well as its arch rival, have Gran Turismo to thank for their enduring popularity. Le Mans 24 Hours was a niche game, and Forza 2023 had a rough launch. Furthermore, both games are 21 years apart. At least the R391 is coming in a future update for the mod Gran Turismo 2 A-Spec. Le Mans 2000 would be the start of Audi's legacy of domination in prototype racing in the 2000s, though much of their opposition from 1999 left for Formula 1. Only payloads remained. Would the R391 be a significant threat to the R8? Who knows? If Nissan did continue the program, they probably would have at least changed the roll hoop to the contemporary style for 2000. Maybe they would have partnered with a privateer team like Courage and or installed that third spring as well. The jury's out whether that would buy them the 4 or so seconds they need to stay in touch with the front. Nissan probably would have kept a limited racing schedule, considerably slowing down development and relegating them to fighting payloads in the wrath of privateers, powered by Judd engines, instead of the Silver Steamrollers. Speaking of the Judd engine, it was lighter than the VRH 50A, despite the extra pair of cylinders. Nissan's center of gravity advantage would no longer exist. The one car running a Judd in 1999's Le Mans was a turd that had to run a high ride height. Perhaps Nissan would have made the engine larger instead of banking on a compact naturally aspirated unit, or reverted to the more powerful VRH 35L. This stall experiment is a moot point, as Nissan was flat broke, and another year of an expensive racing program would have killed the company. Considering the change in ownership, 1999 can be thought of as the last true Nissan attempt at Le Mans. Their history at the endurance after going has been checkered. A year after the R391's demise, a Nissan-powered Lola B2K40 won the LMP 675 category, by being the last man standing. The Nissan VQ-based engine showed up in other LMP 675s, but the class was filled with unreliable cars, so what was in the back didn't matter. 2005 marked the return for the brand to the top class as an engine supplier to Roll Center Racing's Dallara. The power plant in question? A modified version of the VQ30 DETT found in the JGTC 350Z. Roll Center would ditch it for a Judd engine because they couldn't get very much power out of it. 6 years later, Nissan engines were returned to Le Sarthe, this time becoming the power plant of choice for a large chunk of the LMP2 category. These Nissan engines were the VK45DE V8, a successor engine to the VHs found in larger Nissans from the previous century. They even sounded a bit like the R391. Nissan-powered cars to rack up several class wins in the 2011 to 2016 LMP2 iteration. Now, we get to the elephant in the room. Nissan's 2012 to 2015 factory effort. I'm not going into too much detail on these since they deserve their own video, but basically, an engineer named Ben Bowlby decided that he really hated front tires and designed 3 cars that do weird things to them. None of them finished. The last appearance of a Nissan powered car at Le Mans will be the Bicala CLM P101, which also failed to finish, but that's more on the team running the car. Since then, Nissan had purchased an Oreca 07 for unknown reasons. Nobody's heard why. Anyways, Alpine's acting as the LM flagship for the Nissan Renault group, so don't get your hopes up for another return after what happened to the Nissan GTR LM Nismo. As for the other parties involved, G-Force would never build another sports car, but continued to run Indy cars, some with Infinity engines, until Panos bought them. Speaking of that Infinity Indy car engine, that's the basis of the McLaren V8, not the R390's engine. In fact, later IndyCar engines were pretty much V-stroke VRH50As. As I mentioned before, the VRH50A and VRH35L share very little besides being Nissan flat-plane V8s. Nigel Stroud would continue to be hired as a design consultant on race cars, even leading the ground-up redesign of the Cadillac Northstar LMP. Both the R391 and the new Cadillac look pretty similar, though most of this could be down to the rule set they were designed under. If you want to consider Renault's involvement in F1 a spiritual successor to the cat and mouse game between Nissan and Toyota, which is a massive stretch, they totally trounced Toyota, winning 2 championships while Toyota failed to win a single race. With that, the story of Nissan's final Series Le Mans effort comes to a close. It is not without irony that the 90s Nissan race car that won something would languish in relative obscurity, while its winless predecessors and successors will be looked back upon fondly, or seen as cautionary tales. At least they're less broke than they were in 1999? You know what to do if you want to hear about vintage fish and sports car racing. This is an Adontis Man signing off. Adios.